Okay, hi everyone. My name is Jia E Loy. I'm from Zan University. I will be talking about partner effects and individual differences on spatial perspective taking. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the perspective literature, spatial perspective taking simply refers to mentally adopting another person's point of view. So here, for instance, we have two identical mugs on the table. So let's say my partner says, pass me the mug on the left. Now, for me, as the listener, this utterance is spatially ambiguous, since I don't know if they are referring to their left or to my left. So if I interpret the utterance egocentrically by taking my own perspective, I would choose this mug, whereas if I interpreted it other-centrically by taking their perspective, I would choose this mug instead. Okay, so in the current study, we're interested in what influences listeners' egocentric and other-centric tendencies in spatial perspective taking. We're interested in two possible explanations. So firstly, external factors, in particular, who your conversation partner is, and also listeners' own individual differences in their cognitive and social abilities. So with respect to the first, we know from previous work that partner identity influences listeners' perspective choice tendencies. Duran et al. Ran a study whereby listeners saw displays like this, and there were two identical folders on the table, and their partner, so this box labeled worker over here, would say something like, give me the folder on the left, right, front, or back. And so this would be spatially ambiguous on some trials. They also manipulated partner identity across experiments. So participants were either told they were partnered with a simulated computer partner or with another human worker on Mechanical Turk. They then classified participants as either egocentric or other-centric responders based on their dominant mode of response. So which folder they tended to choose for their partner. And what they found was that with the human partner, there were more egocentric responders than other-centric responders. Whereas with the computer partner, they found more other-centric responders instead. Okay, so their explanation here is that perspective taking varies with people's expectations of their partner's abilities. Human partners are viewed as more capable of collaborating than computers, and so people are more likely to shift the burden of perspective taking onto a human partner, so they become more egocentric as a result. Now, the fact that Duran et al. Find these distinct groups of egocentric and other-centric responders is in itself also interesting, because it suggests that there could be individual differences underlying people's perspective taking tendencies. Now, they didn't look at individual differences, but there is a strand of other research which has shown that individual differences do mediate people's perspective taking tendencies. In particular, there's evidence for spatial orientation ability, inhibitory control, and social skills. And I will talk about all these in a bit more detail later on. The catch is that these tend to be investigated separately. So different studies tend to use different perspective taking tasks. And so it's difficult to draw conclusions across studies. So one of our aims here is to look at various individual differences together within the context of a single task. Right, so in the current study, we investigate spatial perspective taking in literature, in listeners. We first look at the role of partner identity. So essentially, we want to see whether we replicate Duran et al.'s partner effects. We have two experiments here, the first with left-right ambiguous utterances, and the second with front-back ambiguous utterances. And then in a third experiment, we look at which individual differences contribute to listeners' perspective choice tendencies. So the task we use is essentially a conceptual replication of Duran et al.'s. We have two identical objects on a tabletop and two avatars representing the participants and their partner. On critical trials, they would be seated opposite from each other, so they have different perspectives. The partner would ask for one of the objects, for instance, the potato on the left. This would be ambiguous, could refer to either potato, depending on whether the participant interprets it egocentrically or other-centrically. And the task is to simply click and drag whichever potato they think is correct over to their partner. So we compare the responses in this condition here, where they have different perspectives, to a condition where they share the same perspective. So here the participant and partner are seated side by side. They have the same perspective of the table. So we expect them to always respond egocentrically, since their left is also their partner's left. We also manipulated partner identity between subjects. So half the participants were told they were partnered with a simulated computer. The other half were told they were partnered with another worker on Mechanical Turk. In fact, both partners were just pre-recorded utterances. We had a manipulation check at the end, which we used to exclude participants who didn't believe that they were interacting with a real human. We had 12 critical trials, 6 same perspective, 6 different perspective, and 36 fillers, in which we varied the sorts of objects that people saw. So they might see a red and a green apple, or a long and a short pencil, and so on. And also the number and configuration of objects on the table. And this was just to create some variation in the displays that people saw. Post-exclusion, we had 274 participants take part on Mechanical Turk. So to determine listeners' perspective choice, we looked at which object they selected on each trial, whether they responded egocentrically or othercentrically. We ran a logistic regression looking at egocentric perspective taking on each trial with perspective and partner as predictors. So here we have the percentage of trials on which people responded egocentrically on the y-axis. The blue dots are same perspective trials, red dots are different perspective trials. On the left, we have the human partner. On the right, we have the computer partner. So firstly, we can see that we found an effect of perspective. So this is unsurprising. It's what we expected since they share the same perspective here. So we always expect them to respond egocentrically. More importantly, we found an effect of partner. So we found more egocentric responses with the computer partner. And if you might recall, this is in the opposite direction to what Duran et al. Found. They found more egocentric responders with the human partner. We also found overall much more egocentrism than they did. So around 80 to 90% in our different perspective condition, whereas theirs was closer to around 50%. And this might reflect the difficulty of left-right perspective taking. So we only included left-right utterances in our experiments, whereas they had both left-right and front-back. And some studies have suggested that left-right perspective taking is more difficult for people. So in the second experiment, we looked at spatial perspective taking with front-back utterances instead. So we essentially ran the same experiment again, except we replaced all the left-right utterances with front-back ones. So the partner might say something like, give me the potato in the front or in the back. This could again refer to either potato. We had 241 participants on Mechanical Turk. And our questions of interest here are A, whether we see the same partner effects, so more egocentrism with the computer partner, and B, whether we see overall more othercentrism compared to experiment 1. So looking at the results, the first thing we can see is that we still get more egocentric responses with the computer partner. So again, percentage of trials on which people responded egocentrically on the y-axis. So we can see with the computer partner on different perspective trials, we get more egocentrism than the human partner condition. So this is in line with experiment 1 and in the opposite direction to what Duran et al. Found. We also found overall less egocentrism compared to experiment 1, so only around 25% of egocentric responses here. So people do seem to be more other-centric here, which is in line with the explanation that front-back perspective taking is easier. Right, so across our first 2 experiments, we see that perspective choice is sensitive to partner identity, although somewhat surprisingly, we find the opposite pattern of results to Duran et al. So to remind you, they found more egocentric responders with the human partner than the computer partner, whereas we found more egocentric responses with the computer partner in both our experiments. So their explanation is that people were shifting the burden of perspective taking onto a human partner because humans are viewed as more capable of collaborating than a computer. So we hypothesized that this flipped result that we see here could be due to a shift in the perception of computers' capabilities over the last decade or so, due to, for instance, developments of AI technology. And so people may actually see computers as more capable than humans in some ways now. And for anyone who's wondering, we did verify this in a recent follow-up in which we manipulated the perceived capability of a computer partner. People do become more other-centric with a computer partner that appears to be very basic and limited in ability. All right, so now that we've established the role of partner identity, in the next part, we turn to the role of individual differences in perspective taking. So in experiment 3, the question of interest is which individual differences contribute to listeners' perspective choice tendencies. We had the same experiment as before, except now we included both left, right, and front back utterances. We had 291 participants on Mechanical Turk. Everyone was paired with a computer partner since we're no longer interested in the partner manipulation. And after the main task, people went on to complete an individual differences battery. In the battery, we targeted 3 distinct processes based on what previous literature has identified. So firstly, social skills. The idea here being that perspective taking is inherently social in nature. So higher social skills tend to be associated with better perspective taking. We measured this using the autism quotient test. We extracted scores for each participant based on the social skills and communication subscales questions in the test. The second process was spatial orientation ability. So the argument here is that perspective taking is a cognitive process that involves a mental rotation of the self into a target orientation. So people with better spatial orientation are supposed to be better at perspective taking. And we measured this using the object perspective test, which requires people to take on an instructed perspective. So here, for instance, they have to imagine themselves standing at a bell, facing the tree, and then indicate the relative direction to the drum from there. And the more incorrect you are, the more incorrect you are from the correct answer, the poorer your spatial orientation is. And finally, we were interested in inhibitory control. So this is based on some studies which have said that taking another person's perspective requires actively inhibiting your own egocentric perspective. So we measured this using the color word Stroop task, in which people have to inhibit a response to, say, the word itself, for instance, green, and respond with the color of the text, in this case, blue. Now, to evaluate the contribution of all 3 individual differences, we included all 3 task measures into our regression model, and as well as perspective, so same versus different. Essentially, we're looking for an interaction between the ID measure and perspective. And what we found was a significant contribution of participants' object perspective test scores. So basically, people with higher OPT scores, which indicates poorer spatial orientation ability, also had more egocentric responses on different perspective trials. And we can see this from the red line on the plot. So here again, percentage of egocentric responses on the y-axis, which we can see increases as participants' OPT scores increase. So the poorer the spatial orientation ability is, the more egocentric they are. And the model also showed no contribution of either AQ score or Stroop score on perspective taking. Right, so to conclude, in our experiments, we found evidence for partner effects on spatial perspective taking in listeners, but in contrast to Duran et al., this was in the opposite direction. So we found more egocentric perspective taking with a computer partner, which we hypothesize is due to a change in people's perceived capability of computer partners nowadays. We also found evidence for individual differences in listeners' perspective taking tendencies, in particular their spatial orientation ability, but not their social skills or inhibitory control. And finally, there are some open questions from our study. So we wondered why we didn't find a contribution of social skills, since this has come up significant in quite a few studies. It is possible that social skills may only be relevant with a human partner. So a recent study by Jia et al. Found a role of social skills when speakers addressed human partners, but not robot partners. So it's possible we might find a role of social skills if we repeated the same experiment with a human partner instead. And finally, we looked at partner effects and individual differences separately. But of course, there's always the follow-up question of how the two might play out in combination. So whether, for instance, individual differences might modulate the partner effect in listeners. All right, and that's all I have to say. Thank you very much, everyone.
So this is really fun. Thank you. I'm curious because you have really large effect sizes, and particularly when you compare just the evolution of how computers are perceived over time. And so I'm wondering if you've possibly discovered a way to look at how people make judgments of other people. So stereotypes, if you have a male or a female avatar, a black or a white avatar, if people are really making judgments about how helpful is this opponent or partner, which seems to be what the computer result is saying, as opposed to perspective taking. It may be an insight, give us insight into stereotype making and so on.
Yes, that's very interesting. I don't think that's something we've specifically considered other than the follow-up in which we look at sort of a basic computer versus a more advanced computer. But I think there are lots of possibilities here. So one thing we did do was we had a post-test questionnaire in which we asked people, what they thought of their partner and so on. And there were a few responses in which people said things like, oh, I thought that, my partner wouldn't be taking my perspective. So maybe I should do that. I should take their perspective instead, which is also part of the motivation for looking at individual differences, but not specifically stereotypes in terms of sort of like male versus female and so on. So I think that would be something very interesting to look at. Thank you.
Thanks. So there's this long tradition in moral philosophy of thinking about the second person perspective as this really important idea in the idea of moral respect, that someone's worthy of moral respect when you can take their perspective and see them not in this third personal way where they're just a subject, but also distinct from the first personal way in which you see yourself, this sort of unique idea of you're putting yourself in someone else's shoes, but still recognizing them as separate from you. Your results in this topic in general just seem really evocative of that. So do you think it's possible that you could read into your results that there's more of that kind of attitude being taken towards computers in your studies, especially with partner effects, as opposed to in the work that you contrast it with?
Can you elaborate a little bit more about the second person perspective and how this comes into play here?
Yeah, so I mean, it's just the second person perspective is, calling someone you suggests both that, you're not at a distance from them, you're not sort of treating them not as a subject at all, but just as sort of something in the environment, like a chair or something like that. But at the same time, it's not it's distinct from me, but it's something like me. It's something that, I could imagine myself as and things like that. And so you take a more egocentric perspective when thinking about how you would describe something in relation to a second person, I'd say on your right or on your left, as opposed to, I would take my perspective in thinking about the right or left of the chair. And so, yeah, I'm just curious whether you think there's some sort of implications of these results for, moral respect and our moral respect attitudes towards different kinds of agents.
So I suppose in this particular experiment, it seems quite disembodied because they are, distant from their partner. So something like that will not be as relevant. But then if their partner did something along the lines of what you said, like use the second person a bit more, then we might see more perspective taking. But I don't know. I would say it's an empirical question.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, there's a question. So someone asked, did you give people feedback after each trial about whether they chose the right potato? If so, did you analyze the adoption over time? That maybe people at the beginning, people took another perspective, but then switched. Would the partner ever change their way of communicating, or were they consistent?
That's a good question. I think that would be interesting to look at, but we didn't give them feedback because otherwise they would actually learn that there's a correct answer. And the point of this task is that there shouldn't be a correct answer because we want to see whether they take an egocentric or other-centric perspective on each try. So that sort of eliminated the possibility of feedback. But I can imagine a different sort of paradigm in which we do give people feedback and we do see how people learn from this and whether this changes over time based on the feedback.
We're out of time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
That was so awesome. Yeah, really, really glad you're here.
I had a lot of fun in that talk. That was really good. Yeah, I didn't get a chance to answer, but I think what you've done right is you split this. It's a good talk. So I got it right. You split this into